Hi everyone, good evening. I hope you're all well. So today we're going to be chatting about celiac disease. Did I spell that right? Yes, I did. I didn't spell it the American way. And we are going to be joined by Natalie, who is a specialist dietitian, paediatric dietitian in celiac disease. And I can see she's online, so we'll just wait for her to join. And this is here we go. She is joining now. Go live. She should be joining us any minute if
Nishti,
technology
how are you?
permits. Oh, hi Natalie.
I'm really well, thank you. Really well.
Evening. Good. How are you? I'm so
Good,
grateful for your
good.
time this evening because I know you have three little girls, and
Don't
I did
worry,
think, oh,
it was tea
you
time,
must have
bath
been busy
time, go,
before
go,
this
go, get
chat
the
to
pajamas
get
in
them
and
all
then run
sorted.
downstairs. So they're all tucked up upstairs. So they're perfect timing, really, perfect
Oh,
timing.
wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much, Natalie, for your time. And thank you for everyone joining us. This is an informal chat about celiac disease. You can ask questions and Natalie will do her best to answer all the questions. We also have a lot that have been sent through, which I think I'll ask you about a bit later. But I just want to introduce you all to Natalie. You may know her already. She's a specialist pediatric dietitian. She has her own private practice and she specializes in pediatrics and obviously celiac disease, but she also works at Great Ormond Street for children,
That is
where
right,
she's the lead
Nishti.
dietitian
I
for
have been there for
dermatology. Is
what
that
feels
right,
like a year,
Natalie?
but it's actually, I think, 14 years this year. It makes me feel really old, I know, but it's a marvelous place to be. It's, I think, part of me
Wow.
now, I think, Great Ormond Street.
Oh, lovely. Well, it's nice that you feel like
For
it's only
sure.
been
And
a
I
year. It
think,
means you're having fun and
it
making a
doesn't matter how long I
difference.
work there, I'm always learning. I'm always, new. The department's so big of dietitians, there's always people coming, younger dietitians that are sort of always learning. And that's what I love about it, right at the cutting edge
Lovely.
of children's medicine. So it's an exciting place to be for
That's
sure.
amazing. Amazing. Wonderful. Well, obviously, it's not Celiac Awareness Week, and I text you and I said, Natalie, do you want to write a blog or do you want
That's
to talk about
exactly what you
celiac
said,
disease?
Nish. Oh, let's
Oh, we
just do it
can't wait
anyway.
till May. Let's just do
But
it
you could do it
now.
again
Um,
when it's celiac awareness week. There's never a
oh, so
limit on
great.
how long I can talk about celiac
Yeah,
disease, so don't worry. Yeah.
definitely. Definitely. Well, I just want to mention why we're here because obviously there was a reason, and that's because we have a lot of adults with non-celiac gluten sensitivity. And maybe we can just touch upon that as well, because a lot of them think they have celiac, but it's not celiac. And it's just so, and I thought, oh, you know what, we really need to talk more about wheat in general. So this whole week we're talking about it. We also have a pediatrician in allergy joining us on Wednesday who will be talking about, Dr. Costa, he will be talking about wheat allergy. So the whole week is focused on the humble wheat. And we're starting out with a bang with celiac disease. So, Natalie, should we just keep it
Of
simple and
of
explain to
course.
people
So,
what
and
is
it is
celiac disease?
confusing, and I think the awareness of what is gluten-related disorders is just sort of, it's like almost getting more and more every year. I think that I work in this area, but celiac disease itself is an autoimmune disease where a person has an immune reaction to the proteins that are found in gluten, and gluten is found in wheat, of course, but also barley, rye. And then a very similar protein is found in oats as well, called avenin. Not quite the same as gluten, but very similar. So what happens when someone has celiac disease is they eat this protein and these grains, and the body is sort of out of sync with itself, if you like. It has a reaction to that protein when it shouldn't really have that reaction. And part of that reaction then sort of damages the lining of the intestinal wall. And on the lining of the intestinal wall, you have these little finger-like projections that are called villi. And there's the inflammation that sort of is triggered by the ingestion of those gluten proteins damages the villi. Causes lots of cytokine reactions and lots of immune reactions that then just cause those villi not to work anymore. So of course it leads to often malnutrition in all sorts of ways, not always weight loss. And in the old days, we used to think you had to be really, you know, malnourished with a big pot belly and tiny skinny arms, and that isn't the case. And I even see that in children as well. So but malnourished in other ways. So you're often anemic, for example, short on iron. You might be short on other vitamins and calcium, vitamin B12, and those sorts of vitamins as well. So it's an immune reaction, and that's really what is key about the differences between like the types of wheat reactions that we're looking at. Is what happens in your immune system and what's happening inside your body when you eat it.
So how is it different to
It's a
celiac
difficult one
gluten
because,
sensitivity?
you know, if somebody comes to my clinic and they say, we don't think we've got celiac disease, we think we've got non-celiac gluten sensitivity. My first dietitian little ring bell says, let me make sure that you were tested properly. So that's always the first port of call. I have to see, did you have enough gluten in your diet when you had the celiac test? So the test for celiac disease is a blood test, a really simple blood test that you can have done at the GPs, for example, or you can have done as part of a workup if you're a consultant, for example. That blood test then looks for antibodies against those gluten proteins that you're eating. Now, we also know, as we know more about celiac disease, that there are different antibodies. So there are some really classical antibodies, and the one we tend to look for is called TTG2, and many people with that interest have probably heard of that before. But that really that's looking at one of the antibodies that attacks these villi in the intestine. Potentially there are other antibodies as well, and we're learning more about those other types of antibodies. Now, what can happen if somebody has had enough gluten in their diet when they had that blood test taken and it was negative? Then they actually haven't got celiac disease, but some patients will often say, I still have these symptoms. I still feel that when I have gluten, I have, you know, terrible abdominal pain. I don't feel well. I feel fatigued, all the diarrhea, constipation, whatever the symptoms might be. And so they choose potentially to have a diet that's free from gluten, but they don't have that diagnosis of celiac disease. Now, sometimes even in those sorts of situations, and the children I look after, if there's a real suspicion of celiac disease, but that initial test is negative and there was enough gluten in the diet, I would still get them to go and see a gastroenterologist just to really be sure. It's unlikely, but we do see you know, occasionally there are what we call the false negative results, and sometimes if it's a young child that's very poorly, for example, they would still often have an endoscopy, and there are some cases that then are diagnosed with celiac disease from that endoscopy, the camera test into the intestine. So the diagnosis of celiac disease isn't very black and white, and people often come to me and ask me questions like, gosh, I've had this blood test, what does it mean? You know, it's very complicated. But really, if you have turned every stone, you've had all the blood tests, you've made sure you don't have IgA deficiency, for example, that can make that blood test a little bit less accurate, and you still think you have a reaction to gluten when you eat it, and you choose to not eat it, that is when you might have that diagnosis of a non-celiac gluten sensitivity. But really, for me, it's the final bit. I come to that at the end. I make sure I've done everything else to make sure that we've not missed something else medical that's happening.
Yes. So basically, you rule out celiac disease first before you think anything else, because celiac disease is a very serious condition. As you said, you know, the microvilli can be damaged, and that could reduce the absorptions of nutrients and result in malnutrition. And is celiac disease a lifelong disease?
I hope so.
Is there
One
a cure
day.
for it?
That's it is a lifelong condition, and I think that's, you know, often on my Instagram page and with patients that I look after, we talk about those emotional aspects of it, because being told that you have a condition that is lifelong really has an impact on you more than you can really say, I think, and especially in terms of your identity as who you are. I know myself, I went through that, and just what that means for you. You know, suddenly you think, oh gosh, my child or I am never going to go out and walk down a Parisian high street and buy a baguette ever again in my lifetime. And, you know, even though they feel like small things, actually that's quite impactful when that information is told to you. And for parents, especially when their children are little, or teenagers, you know, it's still really a difficult time. So that longevity, that long life diagnosis, I think, is probably one of the hardest things that comes with the diagnosis of celiac disease. But there is so much research going on, and it's always a pleasure. I really work closely with Celiac UK. They're a fantastic charity. So if anyone watching just takes a visit to their website, there's so much information on there. But they do lots of funding of great research, and not just in the UK, but there's the equivalent all over Europe, all over the world. And there's lots of research looking into better ways of diagnosing, for example. There's been, over the years, there's been lots of ideas about vaccines and all sorts of things that are going on that really can help us to think, actually, is there a way where people can still eat gluten and not have this immune reaction that occurs? And I really hope by the time, at least by the time I retire, Nishti, that might be the case. I don't know. I'm always optimistic, but I hope so.
Yeah. Yes, we have to be hopeful. Yeah. Well,
thank you.
Yeah, I know you have a little girl, don't you, that has celiac disease. So what happened in terms of the household? Because there's so much to consider. It's not just as simple as don't buy in the ingredients. There's so much else to consider. Could you go through that?
I have three daughters, and my eldest daughter has celiac disease, and she's had it since she was very little, like a toddler. She was about 18 months. So she doesn't really know any different, and because we have it together in my family, my extended family, all of the ladies in my family have gluten-free or celiac. So we always joke that in our family, actually, you're a bit of an outsider when we get together and have big family too. If you eat gluten, you're a bit of an outsider. So I made it my mission, really, to make sure that as a mummy, I show her that, you know, actually life can be really fantastic, even though you can't eat these foods. So, but part of that includes the difficulties, you know, things like school, you know, trying to manage the school canteen, making sure that parties are okay and managed well. These are all things that, as parents, you want your little girl or little boy to just go and enjoy things, you know, and that is always on your mind. Oh gosh, you know, what if this happens? Lots of parents talk to me about their children being fussy and being picky eaters when they're diagnosed with celiac disease, and this comes up a lot. Yes,
and that's actually a question as well. So maybe we can tie that in.
Yes,
there is a question.
Time and time again.
Any tips for picky eating?
I thought about it a lot, and I think it's part of that process. You know, you've probably had a child who has been really unwell to start with. So often you've had a child with abdominal pain. Every time they eat, they can't quite articulate how it feels, but they know eating, they associate eating with not feeling very well. They then have this diagnosis when, it depends on their age, of course, but they have a diagnosis where they're told, oh, actually, the reason that you've been unwell is because you eat these sorts of foods. And so actually eating then becomes this real worry for children, and parents also have this anxiety. And often for families, it might be the first time they've had celiac in the family. So they have to learn what that means, you know, change practices at home, you know, think about eating out and all these things. And there's this level of anxiety that comes with that. So you've got parental anxiety, children and young persons' anxiety, people around them at schools. Often schools get they're trying to do their best, but actually they create quite an anxious environment. And that, of course, leads to somebody just thinking food is just all too much. It's all too negative for me. I'm not really interested. And children often get really used to these few foods that are safe. They know that they're okay. You know, I know that packet and I know that one is safe. And that's how that happens. And I see that in probably all the patients that I look after with celiac disease. But I think to get over that, and it comes with time, it comes with confidence for sure. But I think equally things like, you know, being open and talking to your child, it depends on their age, of course, but giving them that education, that knowledge to understand. And the first thing I always say to families is make sure that your little one understands what happens when they eat gluten. And often if I've asked a child that question, that what they tell you is, you know, they think they might die, they think they might have to go in an ambulance somewhere, or to actually just bringing it into that 101 this is what will happen if you eat gluten at school. This is probably how you'll feel, and it'd be horrible, and we don't want it to happen, of course. But you'll be okay, because actually we'll stick back to the diet. It'll just be this one time. So trying to manage the anxiety is really part of it. But practically, there's lots of things families can do. And on my Instagram page, I did the end of last year, I did a sort of a series of tips for picky eating and celiac disease. So take a look, go down to my grid, and there's lots of me talking about ways, practical things in the family home to help children with picky eating. So have a look at that as well. Yeah, of course.
Oh, lovely. Maybe we can share that. I'll have a look and we can share that afterwards. Because I'm sure it could probably, you know, for someone without celiac disease, even it might be useful tips as well.
Allergy and different dermatological disorders that I look after, they're all the same thing, really. So they're just general tips that I think really help families eating together, shopping, cooking together, preparing foods together, giving children a little bit of autonomy, a little bit of choice over what they choose, one or two things, you know, all of those practical things that families can do. You know, it can really make a difference. So yeah, take a look. But you're right, it applies to everything, really.
Oh, thank you. If, by the way, if anyone has any questions, feel free to ask. I think there might be a question here. Oh yes, and we're coming to that. Thank you so much for your question. We actually have that. It's about probiotics, so we'll come to that. I just want us we need to just highlight for anyone watching this. If you have celiac disease, Natalie, can you have a little bit of gluten here and there?
Yes, Nishti, but it isn't. And of course, you know, each time, so we go back to those villi again in the intestine. Each time a little piece of gluten is ingested, we don't exactly know, but we know that for every person with celiac disease, that immune reaction is triggered and those villi are damaged. Now, if you did that, and we don't, you know, everyone's different, we don't exactly know how long it takes for the villi to come back up again. So we don't really know. If it's 2 weeks, for example, actually, if you had a little bit of gluten every 2-3 weeks, actually your villi would never recover, and that's the danger. So actually, for people with celiac disease, it is a very strict gluten-free diet, and we often think even to the tiniest of crumbs, you know, even things like using the same margarine tub as somebody that's had a bit of gluten bread, and we call that cross-contamination. So even to the really tiniest amounts of gluten, we have to avoid it at all times and forever. You know, there will always be those times that you accidentally have some, and even myself, you'd think that I would know how to not gluten myself, Nishti, but I had some gluten about 3 weeks ago, and as soon as I did it, I thought, oh my goodness, what have I just done? And I read the packet again, and the corner of the packet had folded over, and I pulled it up, and I thought, oh no. I thought it happens to us all. And then just making sure that people know that, and actually it's okay. You know what to expect. You will get better, and actually, you know, you're not going to keep eating gluten. But it's just that balance between being super anxious about it, but also avoiding it, and just finding that balance is difficult, but it does come with time.
Yes. Great. Thank you so much, Natalie. Should we go through? So actually, we'll start with that question that one of the participants has asked. So should my child take probiotics if they have celiac disease? Let me just double check. Yeah, it's sort of the same question as the participant.
Well,
so what's your take on probiotics in celiac?
I think, you know, when it comes to celiac disease, when you think about how the gut has often been, and we often talk about how long it takes to be diagnosed with celiac disease, it can be quite a long time, years in some cases, particularly in adults, you know. So actually, how long your gut has not been functioning very well really leads to what we call this sort of, often this dysbiosis, so this sort of out of sync kilter between the good and the bad bacteria in your gut. Now, this doesn't just give you tummy ache, bloating, changes in your stools. It also can impact on other things. And I'm also very interested in how that impacts on the skin. I'm also interested about how that impacts on the immune system. Now, of course, we know that celiac disease is an immune condition, where the immune system is getting it wrong. So of course, I think probiotics are involved. Now, there are studies, and there's lots of studies in animal models, so lots of mice studies and things like that, where they give a mouse celiac disease and they put it on a gluten-free diet and they give probiotics and not. And they have shown that actually some of the immune markers that are detrimental are reduced in those sorts of animal models. So really positive animal studies have occurred. And there are some studies in children as well, looking at putting two groups of children newly diagnosed, for example, with celiac disease. One group has probiotics, one group doesn't, and they then measure like what's the differences between them. And actually what they've shown in a few studies now is that actually the number of stools, the quality of life improves much faster in the groups that have probiotics. Now, the thing about probiotics is we're not exactly sure what strain does what for what person, in what country, and that is always the difficulty because you can't quite compare it very well. But when you look at all of the studies, they tend to use similar ones, so bifidobacterium, lactobacillus, and actually generally you can say that a multi-strain of some strains of those kinds would be beneficial. So I'm a big advocate, unless there's a medical reason why you shouldn't take probiotics, such as being immunocompromised or something like that. Actually, I'm a big advocate for probiotics. So, yeah.
Wonderful. I hope that answered your question. I think it was Rachel, maybe her name. I just want to add to that, if that's okay, because I see children with type 1 diabetes who also have celiac. And it's just very heartbreaking because type 1 diabetes in itself is a very difficult condition to manage, especially, you always have to think about what you eat. And we talk a lot about the 30 plants, especially if they're older, try and have a diverse diet and more plants, because I often find, I don't know what you think, Natalie, that gluten-free products lack fiber, lack whole, it's not like a source of whole grain. So we're having to, educate on, have some buckwheat, despite its name, it's gluten-free. What do you think about that, the gluten-free diet being low in fiber, all these products?
That, actually, and I think, like with any diet, if you start restricting anybody's diet, start taking huge food groups out of your diet, of course variety diminishes, and the minute variety diminishes, your variety of bacteria in your gut diminishes. So let alone the fact that we've just said that children often have picky eating behaviour, so often they go through a really difficult period where they just get very narrow in their choices that they make, and again that just impacts it again. So the gluten-free diet itself is low in fibre. Now in the last sort of, I would say 8 years, maybe, I'm making that up a bit, it feels like about 8 years, the companies have got much better, and they're adding fibers, they're reducing sugars, they're adding vitamins and minerals to the gluten-free products. And so the nutritional profile now of a gluten-free diet is better than it was, when I first became a dietitian 20 years ago, for sure. And that is really, the work that goes in from the companies to make products better, not only just texturally and taste-wise, but also nutrition-wise, is fantastic. So it is getting there. But of course, absolutely. And I also try and advocate for patients to try and include, as you were talking about, like natural prebiotic fibers, which I often help them to try and have, sort of fermented foods, like things like fermented yogurt drinks and kefir, things like that, if they can, if they sort of can get them in small amount. Even my own children, I think I go through the supermarket supply of gherkins every week, I think, because we just have them with everything. So even those practical things, trying to increase the variety of the microbiome, is always on the front of my mind as a dietitian, for sure. I think it's imperative, actually.
Yeah. Wonderful. Thank you so much. So this actually ties well with what we've just spoken about, because obviously oats is a source of whole grain. It's a prebiotic. So there's probiotic and prebiotic, but anyway, that's not for this chat today, because with nutrition, we can go on and on. And so
it's a
What
really good
can they
question.
have
And
oats?
you know, it's
People
almost
with
like
celiac
the million
disease?
dollar question. I think we have, it's very simple in one respect, that normal oats are contaminated with wheat. So if you just go to the normal section, the porridge section, and you buy normal oats, they will be contaminated with wheat, and that's just because they're milled in a factory that all the other flours are milled in. So they often just have a very high contamination with the other grains that contain gluten. So they're a definite no-go for anybody with a celiac disease. Now, there are gluten-free oats, or sometimes you might see them pure oats, you might see them called various things like that. And what they are, they're just the exact same oat. And sometimes patients will say to me, oh no, but they're different oats. And they're not different oats, they're the same oats. But what they are is that they're milled in a factory sort of on their own or with other gluten-free grains, so they're not contaminated with oats. So it's really important to make sure that if you are someone with celiac disease, that you only go for those oats. But particularly it's that decision whether you have it include oats or you don't. And as you said, they have a nutritional profile that is excellent, you know, and lots of products now, gluten-free products, have oat fiber in them. You know, nutrition, it can really add something to a gluten-free diet. So it's that balance of making sure that people are well enough to give it a try, but actually, you know, is it okay and are they still having symptoms? There are a selection of people with celiac disease who do still react to gluten-free oats, and they have this, what we think is the same reaction to the avenine in the oats as they do to gluten in the other grains. But we don't yet know. I think we're not far off that, but we don't yet know which celiacs will have that reaction to avenine and which won't. So at the moment, it's a bit of a hit and miss. And often, actually, in my clinic, my celiac clinic, often it's children coming actually who still have symptoms, and their local team have said, yeah, you can have gluten-free oats because they're so nutritious. And one of the very first things I'll say to families is, let's do a trial period without gluten-free oats and just see. And there are some patients who just do miraculously better without those oats in them. Their symptoms when they have the oats, they aren't always the same as the symptoms that they have when they have gluten. So it makes it really difficult. You know, it's a very grey area, but I think it does need that little bit of guidance. Now, often teams, so when you have your diagnosis, the team that looks after you or your child would give you that advice. So they'll say, actually, for your child or for you, I would like you to keep gluten-free oats out just until your bloods are normal, your symptoms have gone, and then we'll add them back in. And that's always felt really sensible to me. But more and more, actually, I see families who are told, don't say, okay, you can keep gluten-free oats in from the start. So practice differs all over, and actually all over the world. So actually in Australia it's very different, the USA it's very different. So it's a really grey area, but hopefully lots of research going on. Lots of research, yes.
Oh, I look forward to the research coming out on that, because that is super interesting, I think. But anyway, so in to answer that, short answer is contact your team. Because if your blood still show that, you know, you're still you know, your diet isn't completely gluten-free and you're having oats in your diet, perhaps you need to cut out the
dietitians, because it may well not be the oats. It might be. And I often see families who, with the absolute best will in the world, they've done an amazing job taking gluten out, and because with your dietitian detective head on, you can just, oh, there's just this one thing that you're having that's probably got some gluten in it. So it's not always the oats. And so I think that's where, as dietitians, we can come in and help families really determine whether that's a necessary change.
Yeah, because it's hidden in so many odd foods, and we do have posts that will be shared this week about, I'm not sure when I will share it, maybe tonight, or maybe it's too late to share it, but it's a post that shows like foods that you wouldn't expect to see any gluten in. For example, soya sauce. You know, why would soya sauce contain gluten?
I actually think the thing
I don't know. So it's just this
is vitamins and minerals. So often children, and because families think, oh, I've done the right thing, I've gone and got them a vitamin and mineral, and as soon as they tell me the name, I think, oh, that's what's causing your symptom, and we take it out. and then it's you know within a few weeks you're 100% open. No, but I can
Do you have
do.
a post
I'm always
about that,
thinking of
Natalie?
ideas for what
A
to
post about
write.
that would
Okay,
be
happy
so
to.
wonderful. I mean, if you can do it this week, no pressure. I think that wouldn't that be great, people watching this? A list of multivitamins that are not appropriate and that are appropriate
Yes,
for people with
of
celiac
course.
disease. I would be interested in that as well. Anyway, thank you. Okay, so another question here. What is cross-contamination?
Oh, great question.
And how do you know
we
how
touched on it
sensitive
earlier,
someone
where we
is?
talked about the gluten, you know, the smallest crumb of gluten can cause a reaction in somebody with celiac disease. And even that tiny bit, as we said, in the margarine, so if somebody spreads their margarine, the gluten eater, on their gluten toast, uses the same knife and puts in the marge, gets the margarine and puts it on the gluten-free person's bread, that's enough gluten to cause a reaction, and that's what we call cross-contamination. But there are other places that are sort of high alert cross-contamination areas. So toasters, for example, so I would always encourage families to have 2 toasters if they can, if they've got space. If not, I would get them to use the little toaster pockets that you pop in a toaster. I take mine with me on holiday, and everywhere I go, if I'm staying in a hotel or anything, they come with me. So cross-contamination from a toaster, margarines, jams, spreads, peanut butters, those sorts of things. But also cooking. So often if you eat out, for example, you're making sure that if you have a pizza, it's not touching the other the normal tray that's had all the other pizzas on it. Often they might put a brand new piece of grease-proof paper down or something like that. So it's just making sure that the food that the gluten of the celiac disease sufferer is eating hasn't touched any gluten. Now it's important to know, and sometimes, of course, on the internet you see all sorts of reports about things that aren't quite right. I think that's why I came on Instagram in the first place. I thought, oh no, that's not right. I need to get on there. And so there is something that people often say, that you can't use, say, the same pans and the same wooden spoons and the same chopping boards. And often families get quite stressed about that, and they'll have the celiac person will have the plates, cups, their own whole set of everything. And I always say to my families, that's not needed. As long as you wash it with soapy water before you use it, then you let it dry, before you use it for something with gluten, that's absolutely fine. So there are, it's being careful, but not trying to let it become too obsessive. And sometimes it's that balance again, isn't it? It is hard. I do understand it. It can be overwhelming at times, and parents want to do everything they can to make their child better, but actually those sorts of things, it doesn't need to go that far. As long as you wash things thoroughly in soapy water, it's fine.
And if you have a patient, because some patients are symptomatic, so they will get some symptoms if they've had tiny amounts of gluten, and some people don't. How do you know with cross-contamination how sensitive someone is?
Because some people with celiac disease, remember, have no symptoms at all. So, and often is the case, Nishti, with the sufferers of diabetes, for example, who get just screened, and then actually they go, I don't have many symptoms of that, but they have the condition. So always remember that actually some people have no symptoms whatsoever, but that damage is still being done inside their intestines, and all of the risk factors that come with having those damaged intestines are just as high as somebody that has lots of symptoms and vomiting and all the rest of it. It doesn't correlate. So the worst of the symptoms doesn't mean you're more sensitive to celiac. It doesn't happen like that. So for anybody, literally anybody with celiac disease, I would presume that any level of cross-contamination would cause that immune reaction inside you. So even if your child or yourself doesn't, you say, oh, it's okay, when I have a biscuit every now and again, it's fine, and I feel okay, I would advise against that, absolutely. What you don't know is just what is that doing to the villi in your intestine. So I haven't like a strict sort of, just presume the worst, and that actually the level of cross-contamination has to be nil.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Oh, thank you so much, Natalie. Um, okay, so one more question here. And for anyone watching, feel free to ask any questions to Natalie about celiac disease. So how long do symptoms take to resolve after diagnosis
You know, in all of
of
the years,
celiac?
all the different patients I've looked after with celiac disease, Nishti, I think everyone is different, and that's a rubbish answer, isn't it? Because people want to know. You have patients who you have their endoscopy, you put them on the diet, and within 2 or 3 days, they ring you and say, "Oh my goodness, my child is like a different child," and I've got, you know, you say, oh, yes, they're the ones that give you absolute joy. And then, of course, you know, there are other patients who might take a few months to get back to where they should be. And then there are patients who take longer than that. And I would often say to families, you know, really to see the full improvement in your little person or your big person is about a year actually. And in some cases, I've seen children still have raised GTG after 2 years, and not because they're having gluten, but just because that's how long it's taken for that immune reaction to quieten down. So really up to a year, I would say is quite normal. After a year, if somebody's still having symptoms, I would definitely seek the help of your dietitian that you've been in touch with locally, or somebody like ourselves, just to really see, is there something else going on? Often that's the biggest concern for families, is that we were on the gluten-free diet, we thought it was going to help, but actually we're still having these issues, and we're still having some abdominal pains and different things. And probably they're the patients I see the most in clinic, actually. They just want to know, is there something else, or are they doing it right? Is there something creeping in that's got gluten? So it really can vary so much. Is the short answer to that long-winded answer that I just gave. But I would say within a year, really, that's how long it should be. You should really see a full improvement. But sometimes even longer. It can really depend.
And obviously we don't want to scare people, but celiac disease is a serious health condition. What would the consequences be long term if someone didn't follow a gluten-free diet? I think we just need to talk about that, because unlike non-celiac gluten sensitivity, which is not an allergy, or it doesn't involve the immune system, you know, you can get away with having gluten. Yes, you will feel off, but it won't affect you like it will if you have celiac disease. So what are the long-term consequences
and
for
really,
someone with celiac who doesn't follow the diet?
As the years go by, I think we understand more and more about the impacts of celiac disease and untreated celiac disease. So, you know, sort of 101, of course, you're thinking about malnutrition. So all of the consequences that come from malnutrition. So if you can't absorb iron properly, you don't absorb calcium properly, you have the medical conditions that are associated with that. So iron deficiency, anemia, fatigue. And then, of course, calcium. So your bone density is affected. Lots of older patients with celiac disease who are diagnosed later might be at risk of osteoporosis, for example, fracture and those sorts of things. So all of the things that are consequences of nutritional deficiencies, for sure, that's a given. But then there are more serious consequences even than that, really. And often there are things that can happen later on down the line, such as different types of cancer in the cells of the lining of the intestine, and that can be very difficult to treat, and actually that's probably the greatest risk. So making sure that people are aware of that at the start is probably part of our jobs, I think. Of course the doctors will tell them as well, but making sure that, especially the asymptomatic patients, because you think actually they're the ones that think, oh, probably it's okay, but they are the risks that you're taking. In addition to that, I think what we're understanding more and more about now, and even for myself as somebody who has neurological symptoms when I eat gluten, that you often see patients who don't treat their celiac disease when it relates to neuropathy. They often have absolute complete ataxia, for example, so problems with motility. They're not able to have coordination and balance, speech difficulties. So and all of the things that come from that as well. And in even more so, I think we're understanding the impact on mental health. So often things like anxiety, even agoraphobia, things like that, you see all of the people who have undiagnosed celiac disease or have taken a long time to have their diagnosis of celiac disease. You see all of the same sorts of mental health conditions ripple through those sorts of populations. So it's really far-reaching, Nishti, and I think the big one is the cancer, of course, and the osteoporosis. But there, I think it spreads much further than that,
Yeah.
actually.
Yes, that is very interesting. No, thank you so much, Natalie. So we have a few more people joining us. So we're talking to Natalie, who is a specialist pediatric dietitian in celiac disease. And this is your chance to ask questions. If you have any, we have already answered, well, she has already answered quite a few questions already, so you're welcome to watch it back if you wish. Now, the top 3 things that, I like that, top 3 things, you know, that someone should know if they have a diagnosis of celiac, when it comes to nutrition, you know, what are the 3 key things you would say that people need to know?
For me, looking after children with celiac disease, for me, it's about probably my biggest thing is iron, calcium, and calories and protein. So often, you know, when you have a newly diagnosed child with celiac disease, they are quite depleted. So, you know, if they've come through that sort of classical symptoms of celiac disease. And so really for me, it's about those sort of key nutrients and getting them back on track. And making sure that they enjoy food again. So I often fill my, I mean, you can tell I'm an optimistic kind of person, but I often want the children and the young people who I look after who have been diagnosed to know that eating can be just as enjoyable. You know, I love food, Nishti, I love cooking, I love eating. It's a big part of my life. So gosh, you know, having to be gluten-free, I have to think, oh, you know, I don't want that to be, I want to travel and I want to go around the world. I want my daughters to do that. So for me, it's about that positivity as well. So making sure that families, it's key nutrients, but also making sure families have that hope that actually it doesn't mean that it's all doom and gloom and that everything's shut off and everything's closed off. Actually, there's lots of ways that you can make life just as enjoyable. I'm very passionate about that.
That is really lovely. That's such a nice answer. Because it is, you know, the variety nowadays is a lot easier. Even for me, how long have I been a dietitian for? Not as long as you, but I remember when I first started, the variety is nothing like it is now. And we're talking, you know, 10 years. And it's just sort of boom. But that's because it is also very... it's mainstream, isn't it, to go gluten-free, people thinking that it can help with lots of other sort of autoimmune conditions such as arthritis or even endometriosis, but there isn't there's no proper evidence to suggest that it does help. And we do have a blog coming out on that, because it's just another sort of diet that people are following without actually knowing why, and probably not even having looked into the evidence properly. So I think we need these chats, because you don't need to go gluten-free unless you have, you know, celiac disease or non-celiac gluten sensitivity.
It's sort of like a double-edged sword, isn't it? So when it sort of became quite fashionable to be gluten-free about 5 or 6 years ago, and of course it helped all the celiacs, because we were like, oh, suddenly all the restaurants started to serve gluten-free food. So there was this sort of real mad push on, you know, lots of new products in the supermarket, lots of new restaurants having gluten-free menus and things. So in that sense, I was like, yeah, that's great, I don't mind, you know. But of course, you know, making sure that people's diets are as nutrition full as they can be. And of course, if you take gluten out of your diet and you don't need to, as we said right at the start, you reduce the variety, you reduce fiber. Often it's more refined, processed. There is more sugars added to things that are processed to be gluten-free. And so there is that offset. There isn't many other conditions where gluten has been shown to have an impact on health. So just because something's gluten-free doesn't mean it's healthy. And often that is, so, you know, you see that interchangeably, don't you, in the media sometimes.
Yes, you do. Even on like a drink, like a juice drink,
Yeah.
you know, gluten-free.
Yeah,
And
it does.
obviously juice is
Yeah. So
already
the
gluten-free, but it
celiac
just
tip, if
sells,
anyone's
doesn't
watching
it?
doing celiac, I think, you know, we
But
did sort of thank
that's
that
just
fad
how
because
it
it did
is.
it did push things forward a little bit for us. So yeah.
Yeah. No, I see what you're saying. So there is a question here. My daughter is newly diagnosed and we're waiting for a dietitian app or appointment, but could you give us a general starter point? I'm worried I'm missing things on ingredient list. So is that something you can help with? And obviously, you know, Natalie does provide private support, but I understand people also have the, you know, NHS dietitian
I
referral
do.
perhaps.
And so
And I'm
we,
sure you have
I do.
resources as
Firstly,
well on your
I'm so
website.
sorry to hear that for starters, and also how overwhelming it is. And I really want to say that to you because often families, even myself, when I had to go gluten-free, it was an overwhelming time that I was like, oh my goodness, what does this mean? Even though my family members had it, you know, it still was an overwhelming time. So I do feel for you. Probably my best advice is if you can find my page, I have got lots of information on my Instagram grid helping you through these exact motions that you are thinking now. So thinking about what is gluten, where do you find it, labeling, the things like the little things that catch people out, like barley malt extract and, you know, codex wheat starch and all of those things. There's posts on all of those things in my grid on Instagram that might just help you. It might take a bit of reading, but go back and scroll right down to the when I started, and then, and you know, to make sure that you look for the right resources. So Coeliac UK would be the first place to go to, and I think that is probably the best advice I can give you. Now, the dietitians at Coeliac UK, they're all fantastic, lovely people, and you can call them on a hotline, so you don't have to pay to do that. And so that's probably the first place I would go, actually. And if you can afford to join Coeliac UK, they have some brilliant resources. So they have apps that you can use to eat out. They have the directory on an app where you can scan products and it'll tell you if it's gluten free. So it kind of takes some of that guesswork and that overwhelm out of the equation. So Coeliac UK would be my first place to send you, and making sure you've just got all of the resources that you can. I've also written for the BDA is the British Dietetic Association. We wrote last year a fact sheet on gluten-free, on celiac disease and the gluten-free diet, and that's I think there's also that. I think I've posted that on my grid as well. So have a look at that. That gives you just like the key facts about celiac disease and where to go. And then as soon as you see your dietitian, or you know, if you get in to see your dietitian soon, hopefully you can get the gluten-free diet sheet. So I wrote that last year, which is a huge document that talks you through everything to do with the diet, labeling, ideas for foods, all sorts of things. But you can only get that once you've sort of seen your dietitian. But that, yeah.
But I think it's great that, you know, we see children being diagnosed, because it used to be, you know, people used to go into adulthood not being diagnosed with celiac disease. So at least now, with more awareness, you know, we see children getting that diagnosis early on, and that, I just think that's
and for
a
adults as well,
breakthrough,
you know,
isn't it?
and making
Natalie?
sure that we raise awareness of celiac disease, we raise awareness of just how easy it is to test for it, you know. So you're just making sure that GPs and health visitors and everybody that see patients, you know, on that first line, that first port of call, just has it in their brain. Oh, actually, this patient's come to me, they've got, oh, so, you know, I'm not quite sure what it is, but I'm just going to do some blood tests. Make sure the celiac screen's on that first blood test, and that's raising awareness of that. It's a very cheap test to do, you know, and actually can prevent a lot of time, a lot of NHS money, actually, with people going for unnecessary tests, a lot back and forth to the GP. And you hear it, you know, it's heartbreaking, actually, because you hear it time and time again in clinic where families have had to really fight to still get that, even that first screening test, actually.
Yes.
But it is better than it was, and I think that's partly why I think we come on here and do this initiative, because we want to raise awareness of how people can manage it, and just how, you know, easy it is. And the more people that know about it,
Definitely.
the more it is just on people's minds, and hopefully more people can get diagnosed in a timely manner.
So Talia, I think that's the name of the person asking this question. I hope that's helpful. Can I just add to that as well, that, you know, sometimes it can be overwhelming, let alone cooking meals for your family and then having the celiac on top. So I just think when you have a newly diagnosed child with celiac disease, menu planning, I think, becomes extremely important, because then you can really list out the ingredients, and then you can go, oh, pie, is that gluten-free? Oh no, so it just helps to get overview. And I think when we write things down and we take everything from our head onto paper, it is a great mindfulness practice to do that. But it helps with overwhelm. You know, it helps with overwhelm, which is a natural feeling when you have this diagnosis, and you know, you get all this information, and we have so much information about everything nowadays, you know. So the trick is there to try and reduce the overwhelm, and menu planning, I think, I mean, it helps me, and, you know, there's just the two of us, you know, so, but I'm busy, you know, and if your menus are done and you know what you're having, maybe that would help you as well, Tanya.
You know,
I don't know what you think about that.
I think that's probably a good tip. I have, you know, a massive second freezer, and I just fill it with, so I go to the supermarket with my family, and whatever's, you know, reduced in the free from section, all comes home and we pile it in the freezer. But planning is crucial, I think, absolutely. And when you're busy, you're working, and then the children are at school, and then actually you can't, and often that's the feeling that celiacs often say, is that you can't be spontaneous very often anymore. And that is probably one of the downsides of it, that if you do go out or you do have a meal, you do have to think ahead, because you can't just go to the nearest place and eat. You know, it has to be just a little bit thought through. And of course that becomes easier as time goes on, and you get confidence and you know where to go and where to buy things. But it's that spontaneity that I think it just is always lacking a little bit of that. But planning, really, it does help, for sure.
Yes, planning is everything, isn't it? But thank you so much for your questions. So, and obviously we've answered those other questions as well, and I'm just mindful it's almost 9 o'clock. I could chat with you forever, because, you know, when it comes to celiac disease and nutrition, you can, you know, we can continue. You know, we haven't talked about, you know, the requirements, yes, for example, for calcium, but I'm sure you have that on your grid. We haven't talked about, I mean, there's just so many other things to talk about when it comes to celiac disease and nutrition. So if anyone has any questions before we allow Natalie to, you know, finish off really, for the evening.
Pleasure,
thank you so much for your time on a Monday evening. I know it's
you know, really, you know, the more people that hear about celiac disease and learn about it, the better it is for everybody, I think. So really, my pleasure.
Yes, yes. No, but I just think, you know, because, you know, as I said at the start, you know, I'm just going to mention it again, non-celiac gluten sensitivity has become very big in our clinic, especially in adults. I haven't seen any children with it yet. And they often think that they also have celiac. And so we're having to continue to say the same thing, which is why we're writing a blog. But it's just, you know, I remember 6 years ago, non-celiac gluten sensitivity wasn't even recognized in the medical world. So it's a new term, but it's not celiac disease. You know, celiac disease is completely different. And I think that's where, you know, that's what we want to highlight with this chat. You know, it's a very serious issue.
I've been gluten-free now for, I think, 14 years, I think. And because I have neurological symptoms when I eat gluten, and when I was back then, I was a dietitian, you know, I kind of knew what I was doing and what I was talking about, but people used to roll their eyes at me. Of course you don't have neurological symptoms when you eat gluten. I'd be like, you know, I do. This is what happens to me. And people, you know, I used to see consultants, neurologists, you know, they'd just say, no, that's you, you've read that on the internet, you've got, absolutely not. I'm a medical professional, that I know this happens to me when I eat gluten. And even in that space of time, Nishti, I'm largely because of the work of Professor Hadjibasalu in Sheffield and his team around him, Professor Sanders, actually our knowledge of that in itself is massively improved in just that 10 years of time. And now when you say, oh, I have neurological symptoms with my celiac disease, people go, oh yeah, because that's a recognized symptom. So even in that space of time, the difference is incredible. And I know that in another 10 years, non-celiac gluten sensitivity, we will probably have a much greater understanding. It may well be an immune reaction to gluten. We just don't know what it is at the moment, but that doesn't mean that we won't in time. And I think that is exciting.
Yes, yes. And you know what? This highlights that as healthcare professionals, we have to really honor what people say, how they feel, because we may not always have the evidence to support something.
All the time. You are the experts.
We are not.
Feel and how you,
we are different.
Know your body better than anybody else.
Yeah,
absolutely.
We are all unique. Yeah, and I think we're missing. I think sometimes we forget that we're not, you know, the human being is not a scientific journal.
Totally. And we don't all fit to the textbook.
We are more than that.
Maybe because I work at Great Orchid, I think we're used to that, with the things don't always fit to the textbook. But absolutely, things aren't always the way that the textbook says they should be. And it doesn't necessarily mean that somebody's making that up or exaggerating their symptoms. It just might mean that our medical knowledge isn't quite caught up yet with what's happening. And you know, over my career, I've definitely seen that. So I'm sure more will come for sure.
Yeah. So there is another question. Thank you. This so it's the same person, Talia. This is my daughter's page, as she is following your pages to not feel alone. So thank you for the information. That's so that must be for you, Natalie. So there is, her daughter is following you, so she doesn't feel alone. You know, isn't that lovely?
Because it can feel really alone. And my own daughter, you know, when we went to the Free From shows last year, and we worked for Coeliac UK, we helped out on their stand, and she was so emotional when it finished, because she said, "Mummy, I'm in this room and everyone in this room is like me." And it was really you know, emotional for me, because I was like, oh gosh, you know, all the time she's at school, she's the only one. And actually, although she's, when she's with me, she's not, but it was totally, you know, sort of this profound experience for her, where she was just in this room with other children, because everyone was coming up to us and talking at this stand. It was amazing. And so I think that feeling of community is what I found on Instagram, actually, and Facebook. And even as a dietitian, I know I'm on there as a dietitian, but secretly I get so much from it, being a celiac, because everybody clubs together. You know, I think I want to go here on holiday, I can find somebody who's written a blog on that or something, or somebody on Instagram's been there and they've written all the advice out for how to eat gluten-free somewhere abroad. So the community, I think that's probably one of the biggest, the most positive things that I've found online, actually, that can help people not feel alone, because that's so hard, isn't it? Oh
yeah, and especially at that age where you're trying to, you know, you find your identity, and there's just so much going on hormonally, and let alone a diagnosis on top.
My pleasure. So thank you.
That's wonderful. Well, thank you, Natalie. Thank you for your time. I wish we could get a cup of coffee and just continue the chat. But no,
thanks to everyone, and thanks for everyone's questions. Really brilliant questions.
Thank you for your time. And Natalie has written a blog. You know, if you are watching this and you think your child may have celiac, then there is a blog on nishtischoice.com that Natalie has written. Is also, you can also see it in our stories. And on Wednesday, before you go, on Wednesday, we have consultant pediatrician Dr. Costa talk about wheat allergy, which is completely different. But for anyone interested, that's on Wednesday, 8 p.m.
Thanks to everybody.
So thank you so much, Natalie. Have a lovely evening. Good night. Thank you. Take care. Bye.